I am Tom Lang, and I'm 90 years old, and I developed a brand new and very radically new theory of physics that I'd like to tell you about. I was able to develop this radically new theory of physics because I am not a physicist. I am an inventor, and I like to do new things, new and different things, and I have over 1,000 different inventions recorded in different patent offices around the world. Every claim in a patent is called a new invention and is treated as a new invention. 1,000 inventions came from my 30-some patents. In fact, my latest patent had as many as 300 claims in it. Have you read the book by Thomas Kuhn's? He says that to do radically new and different things, you need to be outside of the profession. I intuitively conceived the beginning of this alternative theory of physics in 1950 at the age of 21, 2 years after I had graduated from Caltech in mechanical engineering. I have degrees in 4 different kinds of engineering: mechanical, civil, aeronautical, and aerospace. My entire working life was in the field of fluid dynamics, as was my PhD in aerospace engineering. And this new theory of physics is based totally on fluid dynamics. My intuition told me that the universe had forever existed in the form of a giant sphere of spatial fluid surrounded by an infinity of empty space. My theory was first published in Galilean electrodynamics in 4 parts from the year 2001 to the year 2008. Additionally, I've written 4 books so far on this new theory, on different aspects of the theory. The first book included the original Galilean electrodynamics article, in addition to describing my new theory, and in addition to including 70 or 80 equations as background. The other 3 books were short books developed to describe this new theory to the general public. You have the book called Our Fluid Universe, which I think is the simplest way to understand it. I wanted to share my ideas in a way that is more understandable to people than my 4 books that I've written on my new theory of physics. So I wanted to animate each of what I consider to be the 10 most important features of physics that lead to everything in the universe. I was impressed by Einstein because his theory was so radically different from anything that preceded. But I intuitively felt that it might not be correct. Einstein's approach explained almost nothing physically about physics. It was all primarily based on theory. And you never want to base a new theory on theory only. What I want to show is how our universe started and a quick look into how it has proceeded up until the present time. I believe that our universe has existed forever in the form of a giant sphere of spatial fluid that is surrounded by an empty vacuum. And all of a sudden, time started, and time was started either by God or by chance. Time permits motion, and because of that, time permits gravity. So gravity immediately acts on our universe, and gravity caused this giant sphere to compress, and as it compresses, it gets hot. It gets it red hot, down to what I call a minimum sphere, where it can compress no longer, no further, and then explosively expands in what people call the Big Bang. The first things to form were photons and neutrinos, electrons and positrons, protons, neutrons, proton-neutron pairs, atoms and molecules, isotopes, and stars and galaxies. The stars are the bright spots and the galaxies are the circles, ellipses, and flat lines. And our universe is continuing to expand, and it's still a very, very young universe. I found that the best way to start photons would be to turn a certain amount of spatial fluid into pure energy, and use that pure energy to form a spherical vacuum that you see in the screen right now. Then the surrounding fluid, spatial fluid, will flow into this vacuum, and as more fluid comes in, it gets compressed more and more until it gets down to a minimum sphere, and then it expands. And as it expands, it morphs into 4 different photons. 2 pairs of photons are formed, each go in opposite directions to each other. Now, if you look carefully at one pair of photons, you will notice that they both spin in the same direction, even though they were given an opposite twist to start with. Therefore, to satisfy the laws of physics, a second pair of photons are needed, which gives 2 more photons that spin in the same direction, but in a different direction than the first 2. Now, as each photon proceeds along its path, and it spins one way or the other, and always travels at the local speed of light. It pulses in and out at a very, very high frequency. Now, the pulsing is important because the higher the frequency, the higher the energy of that photon. So photons can range in energy from very, very little radio waves up to the energy of gamma photons, which pulse at a rate of thousands of trillions of cycles per second. The conclusion is that photons must form in groups of 4 rather than groups of 2 that people normally consider. And by forming in groups of 4, all of the laws of physics are satisfied. Whereas if only 2 were formed, only part of the laws of physics would be satisfied. As far as I know, nobody has explained neutrinos before in this way. Neutrinos are very similar to photons. In fact, they are indeed made of photons in my theory. They start the very same way. They start with a spherical vacuum into which outside spatial fluid flows, and as the spatial fluid flows, it reduces the size down to a minimum sphere. With this minimum sphere, it expands. It's still red hot, but it cools off as it expands, and it morphs into 4 photons that in turn morph into 2 pairs of neutrinos. You will notice that each pair of neutrinos consists of counter-rotating photons, and these are gamma photons, very, very high energy gamma photons. So neutrinos are very high energy particles. They do not cover the whole range of energies like photons do. They are unique in themselves. Because of its counter spin, neutrinos can travel through the entire Earth without stopping. And this animation also shows that 4 photons must be involved to satisfy the laws of physics, but these 4 photons form, as I said, 2 pairs of neutrinos. In fact, just between you and me, almost nobody's ever expressed any of physics in this way, any part of physics almost. Now, in my theory, all electrons start from gamma photons. Now, the 2 high-energy gamma photons approach each other closely enough so that they will attract and then form an orbit around each other. And as they circle around each other, thousands of trillions of times a second, they extend along its circular path because it's made of spatial fluid. See, when it was black, Those are two elongated photons. One is in an energy state, and this red is in a matter state. This is how energy turns into matter, which I think nobody's ever seen before. While we're at this point, I want to point out that positron rings are identical to electron rings, except their cores spin in the opposite direction. The next topic is protons, and protons are massive particles. They're almost 2,000 times more massive than electrons or positrons. But protons are charge-wise the equivalent to electrons, even though they're very, very massive. But at the same time, protons are much smaller than electrons because they are formed by a process that requires a constant angular momentum. And an angular momentum is defined as a radius times mass. So as the mass of a particle in physics gets larger, its size gets smaller, which seems contrary to intuition, but that's the way the laws of physics work. So let's get started then with a proton. Two electron rings were attracted to the positron ring, but on opposite sides. Now you'll notice that the electron rings, when they approach the positron ring, they repel each other. So we now have three rings that are connected to each other, and they are counter-rotating because electron rings rotate in the opposite direction to the positron ring. And as a result of this, and since this is based on fluid dynamics, all of the fluid now drains from the outside electron rings into the center positron ring. So we end up now with an oppositely charged ring because two electrons overpowered the one positron. We now have what I call an E3 ring, which is smaller than any of the electron or positron rings, but 3 times more massive. So I call it an E3 ring, just simply because it's 3 times more massive than an electron E. And then the resulting ring changes charge, so it attracts a lot of positron rings. This cycle alternates between adding electron rings and adding positron rings. And these additions are done several hundreds of times before we arrive at a proton ring. Experiments show that protons have a mass of 1,836.25 times that of a positron ring. So they're very, very more massive than a positron ring, and they are exactly that much smaller than a positron ring. It is one of the two stable rings in the universe. Proton rings are stable and electron rings are stable. This very important proton ring now will lead us to the next animation, which is neutrons. Neutrons are very important in physics, as I will soon show. And at the same time, I want to introduce the most mysterious force in the universe. This animation will show you how important the nuclear strong force is. It is several hundred times stronger than any electrical force or any other force known in the universe. Neutrons, in my theory, consist of a proton ring that lies exactly inside an E3 ring. We simply bring a proton ring near an E3 ring, and you notice this nuclear strong force that I've shown is an attractive force. So what it does is bring the two rings together, and this nuclear strong force is so strong that the E3 ring has shrunk considerably, so it's not that much larger any more than the proton ring now. Even though an E3 ring is basically unstable, it is strongly stabilized by means of this nuclear strong force and the proton ring, which is very stable at the center, pulling the E3 ring towards it. So this is a neutron, which is so strong and so stiff that it's very hard to break it apart. PhD physicists do not take courses in fluid dynamics, typically, so they lack the background to easily follow my theory. Oh, and this is why it's important for me not to be a physicist, because otherwise I could not do this. I'd be trained to do something very different. In this new animation, we show the pairing of a neutron and a proton. It's very important for neutrons to pair with protons because they are found in the nuclei of all atoms. And the problem here is that protons repel each other, so something is needed in every atom to keep it stable and keep it from flying apart. And neutrons do that. They form very strong bonds with protons in a nucleus. Physicists tend not to understand how protons and neutrons can bond together because they are not, in this new theory, they are not bonded by electric forces. They are bonded by nuclear strong forces. And the nuclear strong force is physically shown here. And in fact, we show two different nuclear strong forces, one within the neutron itself and one between the neutron and the proton. Now what has just happened is that the two proton rings have repelled each other with the nuclear strong force, not shown, and the electron ring has been pulled into the center in between the two proton rings. This end formation that we see of these three rings is one of the strongest combinations of forces and rings known in the universe. It is called a proton-neutron pair. And proton-neutron pairs permit atoms to form because it keeps the nucleus of all atoms from flying apart. This is why neutrons were formed. They were formed basically to stabilize protons. This is more of a view graph than it is an animation, but I wanted to show it here in this set of animations because it describes all atoms in the universe. There are 92 known kinds of natural atoms that form in the universe, and there are 23 man-made atoms that have been added to these 92. Now every atom is neutrally charged. All of the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus of the atom, and all the negative charges that have to balance the positive charges are in the electrons that orbit that atom. Now physicists find that if an electron orbited an atom in a circle, it would lose so much energy during each orbit circle that it would soon disappear. It would lose all of its energy. Electrons, in my theory, are tiny gyros, which means they spiral in ellipses rather than spiral in circles, and therefore they can spiral forever without losing energy. Now these circling electrons can only be seen in their solid state, their solid dot-like state. They cannot be seen the moment they pass into their wave state. So orbiting electrons form what they call fuzzy spherical shells. In other words, these trillions of dots that they form each second looks fuzzy because they only appear as dots. Now, several electrons can orbit within the same spherical shell, but when too many try to orbit, they have to form a second spherical shell, and maybe even a third or a fourth spherical shell, depending on the number of electrons in the atom. By doing this, it neutralizes the charge of the atom, because we have to have as many electrons now in an atom as we have protons. Isotopes are defined as atoms that contain more neutrons than protons. And almost all atoms contain more neutrons than protons. But it is not known in physics how isotopes form within atoms. My theory shows it more clearly in this animation. If a neutron is added to an existing proton-neutron pair, I will show how any number of neutrons can be added in sequence. So here we show a neutron separated from a proton-neutron pair, and the attraction between the two red rings will cause the red rings to move together, and the repulsion between the blue rings will cause them to repel each other. I've just shown you how 4 neutrons can be added to a single proton, and as you can see, this can be continued indefinitely. However, the time will come when there are too many neutrons, and they actually get to be so many that a neutron will be released, and this then causes the isotope to be called a radioactive isotope. And I don't believe anybody's ever shown this before, how isotopes form, physically form. This is what I call a steady state, forever expanding universe. I found in my theory that photons and neutrinos actually have a tiny bit of drag that they do not have in standard physics theory. And the reason they have a drag in this theory is that I have replaced all of quantum mechanics in physics by a concept called pulsing. And what most people don't know is that quantum mechanics is based on probability theory. In other words, the probability of this happening or the probability of that happening. It's a pure mathematical theory that has no physical explanation at all. My theory of physics is not. My theory of physics is based on fluid dynamics. Pulsing is well known in fluid dynamics. In fact, underwater explosions, as they rise to the surface, spread out, come back in, spread out, come back in, they pulse on their way up to the surface as many as 6 or 7 times, if they're deep enough. In my theory, both photons and neutrinos have a drag, and this drag is due to pulsing. Although photons and neutrinos exist in a physical state for a tiny, tiny fraction of a second before entering their wave state, they are in this physical state long enough at the speed of light to have a significant drag that's not large enough to stop a photon or stop a neutrino, but it's definitely large enough to greatly reduce its energy. It is the drag of photons and neutrinos that cause a redshift to increase in all starlight coming from the stars. A redshift means that everything is receding from everything else, and this redshift is interpreted to mean that all of the galaxies in the universe are expanding from each other. But I have found an additional way a redshift forms, and that is to lose drag. To have drag means to lose energy, and whenever energy is lost, the redshift increases. And the redshift increases because all light shifts to the red end of the spectrum if its energy reduces. And if I find a new way that this energy of light reduces, such as by photon drag and by neutrino drag, that will increase the redshift artificially from what is commonly believed. So therefore, everything in the galaxy is not moving apart from everything else as fast as scientists now interpret it to move. And this means then that our universe is younger than it is calculated to be by physicists. I think it could be as much as half as old and maybe more, maybe less. Half as old and maybe less. And in my theory, our universe could conceivably last almost forever, which has never been proposed before. This new theory is based on classical fluid dynamics, Because of that, it makes all of physics understandable. Furthermore, this new theory agrees with experiment, and it explains basic aspects of physics. Shows how photons can transform into electrons and positrons, which in turn transform into protons. Furthermore, protons and E3 fluid rings turn into neutrons. This theory has also explained the nuclear strong force and shown physically how it acts to bring particles together and to repel other particles. Matter is found here to be energy moving in circles. This theory also solves the major mysteries of dark matter and dark energy. In my new theory, dark matter becomes very simple. In other words, it's spatial fluid that is still in the universe waiting to be turned into stars and galaxies and other things. Furthermore, everything in the universe moves at a local speed of light. It explains how electron rings can orbit a nucleus at a constant radius without losing energy. It physically explains how isotopes form in nuclei. It explains key aspects of physics, such as physically explaining Einstein's E equals mc squared. Importantly, it replaces quantum mechanics with a concept called pulsing, which is well understood in classical fluid dynamics. Here, everything physically cycles, and gravity is a pressure force. Furthermore, I have found a way in which our universe could become a steady state, forever expanding universe. I did not know at the beginning that my theory would be the correct theory, but intuitively I felt that it would be. So intuition played a very strong role. I think intuition is a ability that everybody has, whether they know it or not, and that can be used by anybody and everybody to help in almost all aspects of their life.
Why was this important to you?
It's extremely important.
Why?
Why? It's a summary of a lifelong search for truth. And it's taken a long time, a long, long time.